unaccustomed as I am to speaking. Thank you for being here. Looks like a great crowd. The name Enmegahbowh is the name of in Ojibwe it means he who stands before his people. He was born in about sometime during the 1810s, actually in Canada, and he lived for the first years of his life a normal Ojibwe life in the forests, hunting, fishing, using a bow and arrow, harvesting wild rice, all the traditional Indian things. At some point, he stayed at a white person's home and learned a little bit of English. There were some boys that the person had, and he learned just a little bit of English. He got homesick and went back to his family. He was probably 10 years old or something. A little later, a guy named Evans held a school near the home, and he attended this school for who knows how long, and it probably was intermittent, but he did learn English, and the teacher was a Methodist. And at the end of the teaching period, they offered Enmegahbowh the opportunity to become a missionary. And with great misgivings, he and his family decided that he would become a missionary. The mission was generally Lake Superior. Let me get another. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, he went up to Lake Superior, Sault Ste. Marie, and they branched out to places like Lance, Michigan, and Madeline Island, and La Coudray Indian Reservation. They did this for 2 years, and they had English partners who worked with them. They learned a lot of skills. They built cabins. They wandered around, and they did a great deal of work without great effect, actually. At the end of this time, he was offered more education, and the education was to be 2 years, and there was another Ojibwe. Oops. There was another Ojibwe in the class, George Copway, who also became a missionary. The two of them and a whole party of missionaries took off from actually Lake Erie and proceeded up to Sault Ste. Marie. Anyway, they spent 2 years, and Enmegahbowh even interpreted a few passages of the Bible into Ojibwe. He did that at Madeline Island. The mission was not too successful. I don't think that they really converted many Indians. But the Methodist Church offered him and George Copway the opportunity to go to Jacksonville, Illinois, for 2 more years of education. They took off from La Coudray, and this map gives a little idea of what we're talking about. You see Rice Lake above Lake Ontario. That was the origin of Enmegahbowh. Sault Ste. Marie was their first destination. They also did missions at La Pointe and Lance and at Coudray. They got this opportunity to get 2 more years of education, and that was in Jacksonville, Illinois, down at the left there. So they started out from La Coudray, down the Chippewa River, down the Mississippi. They got to Prairie du Chien, and they met their leader, and he took them up to what was the beginning of St. Paul, to Fort Snelling actually, where the first treaty with the Ojibwe was being negotiated. And the Ojibwe served as interpreters for the treaty, but only as informally. They didn't do formal translation. Anyway, from Prairie du Chien, they didn't go directly to Jacksonville. They went up to Kaposia and Fort Snelling, as you can see up in the left. And the treaty was negotiated there. And let's see if we can. The land that they were negotiating there was for the land designated 1837. You can see that it extends beyond the Wisconsin River, where we are currently located. And the treaty was negotiated, and the reason for it was pine. The Midwest was just being developed. Chicago was growing. Wood was needed. A lot of pine. Any questions on this map? There's a number of further treaties later on. You might just keep in mind the 1842 treaty, and we'll go back to it. They went on after 2 years of education, and while they were being educated, they worked as pairs. An English-speaking person and an Ojibwe-speaking person worked together. At the end of 2 years, they went up to Minnesota and became missionaries. Enmegahbowh went to Whitefish Lake, if anyone knows where that is, in Minnesota. And he was teaching all by himself. He got very disappointed. He met his supervisor, and his supervisor brought him to another camp. And one of the other white men there, he pointed out, he said, you see that woman over there? And they said, yeah, you should marry her. Well, they got introduced. That evening, she got instruction in Methodist Christianity. The next day, they were married. If you can imagine that. They married. They stayed married their whole lifetime. They continued for a few years, they continued the mission to the Ojibwe, and were not very successful at it. And let's see, they finally settled at Gull Lake in Minnesota. Gull Lake is right near Brainerd, if you know where Brainerd is. they settled there, and there were a number of chiefs there. One of them was which one was it? Well, there was Indian chiefs there, and quite an Indian settlement. Okay. There was another great event that happened in 1850. If you who are historians probably recognize that Jackson in 1835 decreed that all the Indians should be removed to beyond the Mississippi. Is that familiar to you people? Good. Anyway, that was the doctrine in those days. And the governor of Minnesota in 1850 had a great idea. His idea was to, late in the season, attract the Ojibwe from Wisconsin to Minnesota, Sandy Lake, Minnesota, where the government distribution of goods would take place. The plan was to delay this until snows and essentially strand the Indians in Sandy Lake, Minnesota. And apparently, there's no official figures, but probably several thousand Ojibwe went to Sandy Lake. The provisions that came from the government were inadequate, maybe tainted. Anyway, people began to get sick. And when they got sick, when they died, the Indians would fire a shot. And there were practically continuous shots being fired. Actually, 150 Ojibwe died at Sandy Lake. These are many of the people from Wisconsin. I think I got another slide here of that.
Yeah, just manually move it here.
This shows the distribution of the Ojibwe Indians as a census of the U.S. government. You can see some of the familiar areas that still exist. La Coudray, Madeline Island still exists. Anyway, this is a distribution. All those Indians came up to, if you can see, Sandy Lake is it on there? I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, Sandy Lake is way up there. When 150 people died, Ojibwe died, the Ojibwe decided to go back to Wisconsin, to their home places, which they did, but it is estimated that another 250 Ojibwe died on that. So 400 Ojibwe estimated that died as a result of this attempt to move them to over the Mississippi River. There was a backlash to this, though. There was a Mental Hall, who was a mining guy up in Michigan, plus other politicians felt sorry for the Ojibwe. The result was that reservations were formed in Wisconsin. Lac de Flambeau, La Coudray, Madeline Island, Bad River. All these were established essentially as a backlash from this tragedy. The only thing that really differentiates it is a plaque at the site, which tells most of the details. But the history in general is very sketchy. Any questions on that? Yes.
How many moved to Sandy Lake to begin with?
There's no census. There's no good number that anyone has. But it would seem to be maybe a couple thousand. The Ojibwe population was probably, at that time, was probably 10,000 in the United States, plus some in Canada. Okay. Anyway, a lot of Indians died. The result was reservations in Wisconsin. Enmegahbowh actually got away from being a missionary, a Methodist missionary. He just got discouraged. He couldn't do anything. He lived with his wife for maybe 6 to 8 years as an Ojibwe at Gull Lake. But he had contacts. One of his contacts was the chaplain at Fort Snelling, who knew about him being a missionary. And a guy named Breck, I don't know, are there any Episcopalians here? You probably have heard of Breck, James Lloyd Breck. How many have heard of James Lloyd Breck? Okay. Anyway, Breck was a very driving person, and he came from Nashotah in southern Wisconsin, went up to St. Paul, formed a missionary at St. Paul, which St. Paul was just a village at that time. And he trained a number of missionaries and had missionaries in Stillwater and a few places like that. And he heard about Enmegahbowh through the chaplain at Fort Snelling. And he went up to Gull Lake and he met Enmegahbowh and they hit it off. And Brick was a very driving man. He had a lot of connections, a lot of things he could do. He formed a mission at Gull Lake, and they began to teach them farming, building buildings, and of course, Episcopalianism. Let's see who's next. This is James Lloyd Breck. As I say, he was a very driving person. He married one of the teachers that came up to Gull Lake. It finally was a contingent of probably 6 or 8, 10 people, including teachers, farmers, blacksmiths. Give you some idea. This was the first church built. This was built in 1852. That was built in 1852. They built it primarily with axes. It became a village. That is, there were many buildings. They had schools, they had dormitories, they had the church. The staff was probably 6 to 10 people, teachers, farmers, all kinds of people.
If you want to just let me know when you want to switch, I can manually go.
Pardon?
If it's not working, just let me know if you want to go.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
The mission was very successful for about 6 or 8 years. And then Breck, who was very forceful, he wanted to form a mission similar at another lake, and he took off with his wife and a small contingent in late fall of 59, I think. And when the hunters came back, they were antagonistic. They threatened the missionaries, and they simply they couldn't maintain the missionary. And Ebenezer Steele PEAKE had taken over the Gull Lake mission with Enmegahbowh. So that's, can you imagine a man with a beard like that? I see a few out here. Okay. This is a village that was near Gull Lake, and you can see what its subtitle was. There were 4 or 5 traders there, and they all sold whiskey, and there was a church, and it was actually the metropolis of northern Minnesota in the 1860s. There was no other settlement really in Minnesota in that time. So somewhere on there's a church, but I don't know where. Since Brick was an Episcopalian, when Whipple became Bishop of Minnesota in 1859, Whipple went up to Gull Lake to meet Enmegahbowh. They met, they formed a lifetime relationship, and it's just amazing what Whipple did, his efforts for the Ojibwe. Remember, at that time, the Ojibwe were meant to be either assimilated or eliminated. That was their fate. He became an advocate, and he had connections. He had relatives in U.S. government in Washington, and he was very influential. He supported Enmegahbowh. Clement Booley, it's pronounced Booley, was a trader in the settlement, and he played a big part in conversations between the Ojibwe, the whites, and government, and everything like that. Other than that, he, I suppose, prospered, selling whiskey, selling goods. Give me another one. Holden today. How many have heard of Holden today? Nobody ever heard of Holden today? Holden today was an Ojibwe chief. And if you know Ojibwe custom, there were at least two kinds of chiefs. There were chiefs who were elders and sort of governed, and there were war chiefs. And of course the war chiefs were interested in war. And Holden today was a war chief. And of course there was a great friction between the Ojibwe and the government and the traders. And Holden today, in 1862, at the same time as the rebellion of the Sioux in southern Minnesota, he was going to rebel. Enmegahbowh heard of he was going to raid the government warehouse. Enmegahbowh heard of this, and he ratted on Hole in the Day. And they became great enemies, at least for a while. There was a lot of negotiation that went on. The U.S. Commissioner Dole came up and took charge of and he got bested by Hole in the Day, because Hole in the Day was sharp. Anyway, Hole in the Day played a big part in trying to put down the programs of both the U.S. government and of the traders. And it nearly resulted in a rebellion, which was betrayed by Enmegahbowh, and Charlotte played a part in it also. In 1867, Enmegahbowh moved his missionary from Gull Lake to White Earth. White Earth was a big, huge reservation, completely uninhabited, and very good terrain, both flatlands for farms and woods, and it was prime territory. This church was built, a benefactress from the East financed it, a woman from the East, and that was the church at White Earth. Oops. This is the interior of the church, showing a few Indians and some people officiating. The woman who endowed the church also endowed this hospital at White Earth. Actually, it never was used as a hospital. The Indians simply refused to be confined in a hospital. And it was used primarily as a house for visitors and a place for meeting. Anyway, it was a magnificent building in those times. Bishop Whipple assigned Joseph Gilfilllon to be the supervisor of all the Indian missions in Minnesota. He was a very forceful person. He learned Ojibwe quickly. He formed churches. He taught Ojibwe. He taught 9 Ojibwe to be deacons in the Episcopal Church. These are the 9 deacons that he taught. In the upper left, you'll see a Johnson. That was Enmegahbow's English name. That was Enmegahbow's son. He became a deacon in the Episcopal Church. The others were all Ojibwe. Were they effective? Somewhat. I don't think greatly, but these are all under the supervision of Joseph Gilfilllon. He taught them all, and they occupied churches all the way up to Red Lake at about 5 different places in northern Minnesota. So it was a great effort. And of course, Bishop Whipple supported this with money, with politics, and it was Whipple and Gilfilllon were a team. Here's Gilfilllon dressed for winter travel. He walked from Leech Lake or White Earth to Red Lake, a distance of a couple 100 miles in wintertime. And this is the way he dressed for walking. Enmegahbowh dearly desired a stone church in White Earth. You saw the first church was sort of a ramshackle shack, and he and GILFILLON raised money to build this church. This was completed in the 1880s. So that was the Indian church in White Earth. Oh, this is Whipple's wife, very pleasant woman. She actually died from an accident that happened on a train. She got hurt and actually died from that. There's Bishop Whipple in late life with his second wife. His first wife died, and he married an heiress with lots of money, which he, I suppose, did intentionally. Enmegahbowh died in 1902, and he had 11 children. All of them died before he did. So he had no survivors. No survivors whatsoever. He was in 1902, and he had spent his life primarily as a missionary. That's about what I have. It's all covered in the book. Let's have questions.
What prompted you to do this project, and how difficult was the research? Where could you find any?
Okay. I actually served on a thing called Episcopal Community Services as a director, and one of the other directors was Steve Schaitberger. And Steve had a collection during his lifetime of letters from Whipple, primarily Whipple and Enmegahbowh, but all about Indians. And the Episcopal Community Services went down the tube, and we had a last lunch together, and he asked me if I wanted to transcribe these letters. I shrugged my shoulders and said, okay. It turns out that there were about 1,000 letters. And so I transcribed them onto a computer, cataloged them by date and person, which formed the basis for the book. It isn't the complete basis, but it was a start. So then we started writing, and we clashed a lot. So it took a couple of years to write. And Steve is very good at selling, and I'm less good at selling. He's right in prime territory. He lives in Brainerd, Minnesota. So he sells a lot of books. So anyway, we wrote it together. I think I was a primary writer, but Steve had input. And we made many trips to the Historical Society of Minnesota, Wisconsin, anyone we could find, libraries. It took about 2 years to write the book. So, okay. The book is for sale at the back there, but let's have more questions.
Can you talk a little bit about the Chippewa Indians that were in Wisconsin?
Ojibwe and Chippewa is the same thing. Chippewa, actually, the preferred name now is Ojibwe. Chippewa is a English version, which the Ojibwe don't like. So we talk of them as the Ojibwe. We don't want to offend them, and we can shrug it off. Yes. Any more? Yes.
Do you know if Wausau was part of the 1847 land treaty?
I'm sorry.
What, was Wausau Ojibwe land?
Wausau was ceded before the 1850 treaty. Back to the first map. No, one for, next one, that one. You see the 1837 treaty went 20 miles beyond the Wisconsin River. But there previously had been ceded 1 year before. How much was that on each side of the river?
Yeah, so there was a treaty in 1836 before the one with the Ojibwe, with the Menominee, and it went up the Wisconsin River 3 miles on each side of the river, and it basically went from a little south of Wisconsin Rapids up to the Trap River. So that would have encompassed both. So the Menominee got some payment from the government, the federal government for that, but then the Chippewa kind of were part of the second one, the second year. So, yeah.
There was a lot of contention about all these treaties, and the Ojibwe, of course, were completely illiterate in English. They couldn't understand any documents. They probably didn't understand maps too well. So the treaties were dictated essentially by the American representatives. And the Ojibwe said, okay, and put X's on the treaty behind their name. More questions?
Yeah.
If there's no more questions, we'll proceed.
Thank you.